Okay, let's also look at this proverb and understand a second idea. So, the one who states his case first seems right until another comes and examines him. Let's think about this as proof that thinking is a skill that needs to be taught. Do you see where I'm coming with that? How does this proverb prove that thinking is a skill that needs to be taught? Because what this proverb is doing is teaching you how to think. Does that make sense? So one of the things we see here is that that thinking is a skill, and that means that not everybody's equally good at it. So some of what we need to start grasping hold of in order to process information is that thinking is a skill and that not everybody is equally good at it. Now, this is somewhat actually challenging right now because that would involve creating a hierarchy and saying that some people are better at this than other people. Now, you can do that with other things, but you can't do that with thinking without offending people quite quickly. To say, hey, you're not as good a thinker as this person is. That has all sorts of really interesting offense built into it. But if you were to say, hey, you're not as good a guitar player as Jerry Garcia, that doesn't seem as offensive. So what's going on? Well, because thinking has all sorts of tendrils built into our indwelling sin related to identity. Intellectual pride goes all the way back to the garden. I'll talk about that in a minute. It feels offensive for someone to say to us, or for us to acknowledge to ourselves, that maybe we do not have as much skill in thinking as someone else does. Now, let's qualify that a great deal. What I'm saying is that there's a tension. There's a tension between two, and we're seeing this in the COVID situation. There's a tension between two wrong positions. And the first wrong position is that thinking isn't a skill. Everybody's equally good at it, which means everybody's opinion counts, and so on and so forth. And in that respect, we would say that would sort of be like let's just put a guitar up on stage at church, and whoever wants to come and lead worship can lead worship. And let's pretend that knowing how to play the guitar, we don't believe that's a thing. We don't believe it. There's a category that exists of, do you know how to play the guitar? We just believe that everybody knows how to play the guitar. Okay, so then let's imagine what worship would look like if that were the case, and we didn't actually believe that there was a category for knowing how to play the guitar, and everybody could know how to play the guitar, and if you told someone they weren't as good as someone else at playing the guitar, they would get highly offended. Well, that's going to create a really messy, chaotic, noisy environment. And I think if you look at our world today, you will see that it looks like something like that. It looks like the kind of place, at least in certain circles, where everyone believes that thinking is just like not a skill, and that you don't have to get good at it. You don't have to try to get good at it, and so on. So there's some of that in our culture, and that's just junk. That's not true at all. And then there's another piece of it, another tension that also exists, and that is on the far other side of the spectrum is a strong hierarchy that says that only people with titles and X amount of education have the right to claim an opinion about this or that thing. And so this would be the extreme deference to experts. And this would also be wrong because thinking is presented in the scriptures as, first of all, relational. And that means that if you know Jesus, you're going to have a leg up on knowing the truth. But secondly, it's presented as the kind of skill that you could learn if you wanted to. And so what we're talking about with thinking, from a biblical perspective, is that there is a soft hierarchy, meaning it exists. There are some people who have put more work into learning how to think than other people. And so there are people who are better at thinking than other people. But it's not the kind of guarded, rigid hierarchy that we don't let people ascend, or that once someone gets to a certain level, everything they say is just deemed to be, what's the word, immutable, or just beyond, beyond questioning. That's not what we're saying. Thinking isn't that way. In some respects, if you want to get better at thinking, you can. And the problem is that like you've got to keep working at it, because we're not going to assume just because you were once good at thinking that you will always be good at thinking. That is in stark contrast to where we find ourselves as a culture right now. Either everyone thinks that they are equally entitled to thinking, having their thoughts be valued equally in kind of an egalitarian way, or we've got this rigid, very, almost fascistic hierarchy that's like, if you don't have 30 years of epidemiology, like you can't have an opinion. And what we're seeing is that people don't feel like they have to be consistent between those two extremes. They can simultaneously get offended if you question their opinion, while also showing extreme deference to people who have been, rightly or wrongly, elevated to a position of being an officially good thinker. The Bible is more egalitarian than that elitist perspective. It really is anybody can learn to think. And a big part of that is because God reveals himself to people. And that's what Jesus is, I praise you, Father, that you have revealed these things to little children. So part of the reason why the way we think about thinking as a skill is more egalitarian is because God comes to people, God comes to the weak, to the foolish, and he discloses himself to them. He is the truth, and so people can come to know the truth that you don't have the credentials or the upbringing or so on. So we believe that it's way more it's way more like learning to play the guitar than it is getting 12 years of education at a school. But we do believe that there is a skill, and you do have to commit yourself to it, like you would have to commit yourself to learning to play the guitar. That's, in many respects, what the entire book of Proverbs is about. So if you have your Bibles, look just at the first chapter of Proverbs, beginning in verse 1. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight, to receive instruction in wise dealing, in righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. Let the wise hear and increase in learning, and the one who understands obtain guidance. To understand a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. So that's what Proverbs is for. And not only is that what Proverbs is for, but that's what you should be aspiring to as a Christian is, what does it mean to love God with my mind? Well, it probably means like taking learning lessons, taking thinking lessons. That's probably a big part of this. You can't assume that you are as good a thinker as you could be. That's just simply not true. Unless you're devoting yourself to the task of learning how to think, you will not be as good a thinker as you could be. But we would also say, but you could be a good thinker, and there's nothing keeping you from that. Finally, related to this, and this is very controversial, but it's just the way the Bible presents it, not all cultures are equally good at thinking, because not all cultures have equally invested themselves in the act of thinking. And so when you see, for instance, the Bereans in the book of Acts, they were a more noble culture because they were more reasonable and more prone to thinking. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means, in terms of application, not all churches, not all denominations, not all flavors of denominations, and certainly not all homes will be equally devoted to the task of thinking. And that also means, of course, that not all cultures, not all cities, not all political parties. Like, there's a lot of things here that this means. It means that because thinking is actually something you must work for, we know already that that not everybody does the equal amount of work in any area. So that means that not every family, culture, church, city, whatever, is going to be equally as good at thinking. But we would say it does mean that anybody could be. There's no there's no there's no authority of man that is going to prevent a person from being a good thinker. And there isn't any kind of racial or gender reason for someone not to be a good thinker. It would literally just be because someone has chosen not to devote themselves to the skill of thinking well. Okay, so there's another video for you.